Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're doing something a little different. We are stepping right out of a lethal Scandinavian winter and we're crossing the threshold into the living, breathing survival machine that absolutely governed daily existence in the Viking Age. You know, we really need to forget those old pop culture caricatures of simplistic barbarism. Instead, we're going to reconstruct an entire human world through the very architecture that made their survival possible. We'll observe firsthand how ordinary people experienced incredible hardship and, frankly, astounding resilience in one of the most demanding climates on Earth.
So let's get into it with our first section, the Arctic Survival Machine. Because this longhouse, it literally stood between life and a lethal climate.
To really understand everyday Norse life, we have to grasp the brutal constraints of their environment. This was absolutely not a civilization built in temperate comfort. Outside, the temperature could plunge to a deadly 30 degrees Celsius below zero. Just try to imagine that sensory reality for a second. A frozen wasteland where winter winds cut relentlessly across barren hills. Make one miscalculation out there and your survival was measured in hours. Out here, a house wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a highly calibrated instrument designed to keep the lethal freeze at bay.
But if you were to open that heavy door and step inside the longhouse, you'd immediately be enveloped in a stable baseline temperature of about 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. Now sure, that might feel a bit brisk to our modern sensibilities, maybe light sweater weather for us, but against the deadly backdrop of a Nordic winter, that was a profound engineering achievement, and it was sustained entirely without any modern heating systems whatsoever.
Okay, so how did they actually do this? Well, this engineering marvel relied on a really clever, ship-like aerodynamic design. They used curved longitudinal walls to actively minimize wind resistance against those howling Arctic gales. And depending on what resources they had, builders threw together a composite of local materials. Up in places like Iceland, they relied heavily on incredibly thick turf insulation to trap the heat, and they layered that over wattle, daub, and these solid stone foundations. That stone was absolutely crucial because it stopped the cold from seeping straight up from the frozen earth.
Moving right along to Section 2, Harnessing Fire and Shadows. Let's look at the actual thermodynamic engine of the longhouse.
Once you move inward, the sensory reality of this space totally shifts. It was defined by a pitch-black darkness, pierced only by the really dim glow of the central hearth. And the airflow mechanics in here, they functioned as this incredibly delicate critical balance. So you have the central fire, the Lungildare, burning right there in the dirt corridor. As the smoke rose, it would hit an unusually low ceiling, and this was deliberate. It created this thick, honestly pretty toxic, heat shield right above everyone's heads. It made your eyes water, it smelled heavily of damp wool and wood smoke, but this acrid canopy was absolutely necessary to stop all that precious warmth from just escaping into the sky.
So how did they not suffocate? They managed this stinging smoke through what they called a vindauga. This was a small, adjustable roof vent. And fun fact, it's actually the etymological origin of our modern English word window, wind-eye. But unlike a modern pane of glass designed to let in sunshine, this was strictly utilitarian. It was designed to vent just enough smoke to keep everyone breathing, but it could be sealed tight enough to trap the heat. They very consciously prioritized thermal retention over breathable air or natural light.
And the thing is, this whole ecosystem was warmed by more than just burning fuel. Sure, they could burn up to 54 kilograms of birchwood every single day in those central pits. That's a massive amount of wood. But the true genius was combining that active heating with passive metabolic heat. I'm talking about the body heat of the human occupants and their livestock. Yeah, cows and horses were sheltered right under the exact same roof at the far end of the longhouse. So every breath, every body huddled together in layered furs acted as a living thermal battery for this unified thermodynamic machine.
Which brings us to our third section, hierarchy, caste, and timber. This is where we see how architecture actually enforced social order.
You see, the physical space of this wall-less interior, it was definitely not some communal, egalitarian utopia. It was a strict, unavoidable map of Norse society. Literally every square meter was defined by the cultural concept of verding, an individual's worth. Because there were no interior walls, there was absolutely zero privacy. Your spatial positioning was strictly dictated by your status, and your entire existence played out under the constant, inescapable public gaze of your community.
To put that into perspective, the high-status jarls, the nobles, they commanded the warmest, most central, and most protected spaces in the house, usually seated on a really elaborately carved high seat. Then you had the carls, the freemen and farmers, who lived and slept on these raised wooden side benches surrounding the fire. But then there were the enslaved thralls.
They were relegated to the freezing, drafty margins near the doors, or worse, they were forced to sleep directly in the manure of the animal stalls just to stay warm. In the Longhouse, architecture itself was quite literally a weapon of social control.
Let's transition to Section 4, the labors of daily life. We'll explore the sensory reality of their survival and material culture.
When we zoom in on the daily existence of the Carls, we find a world completely defined by relentless, highly organized labor. Throughout the daylight hours, the rhythmic clacking of the warp-weighted loom would have just dominated the auditory landscape in there. Women basically drove the Norse economy right from those benches. They were spinning and weaving everything from delicate daily garments to wadmal. Wadmal is this incredibly dense, heavy wool cloth that was required for Viking sails. Think about that for a second. Without this intense domestic textile production, the famous Viking expansions across the seas would have been completely impossible. No sails, no Vikings.
And as those short, bitter winter days gave way to seemingly endless nights, the perpetual gloom of that windowless interior was pushed back by small ceramic bowls. These simple lamps burned pungent fish, seal, and whale oil. It didn't provide much, but it was just enough of a dim glow for the occupants to keep working on winter crafting, tool repair, and of course sharing the sagas and oral histories that bound their whole culture together.
Now, contrary to the modern caricature of the dirty, unkempt barbarian, the archaeological record actually reveals a civilization that was deeply committed to personal grooming. Honestly, settlements and graves are just filled with these intricately carved bone combs. The Norse took immense pride in their appearance, and they even carried these combs with them on their perilous overseas voyages.
They even utilized delicate ear scoops. Yeah, ear scoops, tweezers, and toothpicks were all part of their regular grooming kits. This really reveals a highly organized people whose harsh, suit-filled survival environment didn't stop them from having a deep commitment to personal hygiene and aesthetics.
And right at the center of this entire domestic universe stood the husfreyja, the master of the house. While the men were frequently away trading or raiding, she commanded this entire domestic factory. She directed the labor, she literally held the keys to the chests, she possessed the legal right to inherit property, and get this, she could even initiate a divorce. She was the absolute anchor of economic stability in an extremely volatile world.
So looking back at the smoky, crowded, hierarchy-bound world of the Viking Longhouse, we're really left with a profound question. Our modern lives are totally defined by segmented spaces, individual climate control, and this fierce need for privacy. But we have to wonder, could our isolated modern comforts ever foster the kind of profound, life-saving resilience that the Vikings found by literally huddling together against the cold and the dark? It really challenges us to rethink what comfort, community, and survival truly mean.